Part 4. The Odyssey. Chapter 35. We stayed on that island in the middle of the Minnesota River for 2 full days while Albert continued to recover his strength. The wall of jumbled driftwood, much of which was whole tree trunks that had been carried on the raging river's back during floods, offered us both shelter and a blind behind which to hide from prying eyes, although in the time we were there, I saw not a single soul along the riverbanks. I made Emmy another sock puppet to replace Puff, which Jack had taken from her. For this one, I fashioned bunny ears and took one of the cotton balls from the medical supplies Sister Eve had given me to tend Albert's wounds and tied it with thread as a little tail. I diluted some iodine with a little water, put a small drop below the button eyes as a pinkish nose, and on either side made 3 whiskers with black thread. When I presented it to her, she was delighted and promptly named the puppet Peter Rabbit. When she'd handed me the paper bag of medical supplies, Sister Eve had told me she'd put in a few other useful items. They turned out to be 5 $10 bills. I thought maybe it was one of the envelopes I'd seen in Sid's satchel. It wasn't nearly the size of the windfall we'd found in the Brickman's safe, but it was still a lot of money in those days. The second morning on the island, I took one of the 10s, and Mose and I crossed the river channel in the canoe. I made my way to the nearby village, whose lights I'd seen in the night, and found a small market where I filled the water bag and bought food supplies. When I saw that they sold night crawlers as bait, I bought some of those too, along with a roll of fishing line and a package of hooks. I also picked up the most recent issue of the Mankato Daily Free Press, because Emmy was part of a front-page story about the Federal Kidnapping Act, or the Lindbergh Law as it was to become popularly known, which Congress had just recently approved and which made the taking of Emmy a federal crime, a capital one. We could get the chair. When I gave him the newspaper, Albert read it to himself, so as not to alarm Emmy. Mose and I were already well aware of our precarious situation. The one element that offered a measure of relief was that Sister Eve and the Sword of Gideon healing crusade weren't mentioned. According to the article, there was still no news at all concerning the fate of Emmeline Frost, the kidnapped girl. Thelma Brickman had been interviewed about the impact of the Lindbergh Law on her own heartbreaking situation. She was eloquent in expressing her fear for the safety of her sweet little girl, and God alone knew what horrors those deviants might be subjecting her to. Whoever they are, the article quoted her, these criminals must be the devil's own disciples, and they deserve the swift and merciless punishment this new law dictates. Albert said, "I think our camp needs some livening up, Emmy. Could you gather some wildflowers for us?" She looked delighted at the prospect and scampered off. "I don't understand it," I said when she'd gone. "The Brickmans know we took Emmy. Why don't they just say that?" "Because it could get messy for them," Albert said. "I think they want to conduct their business with us as privately as possible." "How? Ambush us and kill us?" I'd said it in dark jest, but I could see from the look on his face that Albert wasn't kidding. "Something I haven't told you," he said. "Bring me the pillowcase." I retrieved it from the canoe and handed it to my brother. He reached inside, drew out a small book bound in black leather, which he opened. Page after page was filled with names, dates, money amounts. "A ledger," Albert said. "Payoffs of some kind. Sheriff Warford's name is in there. The Lincoln police chief, too, and the mayor." "Payoffs for what?" "I don't know. Maybe the bootlegging. Maybe other things." My brother closed the book, looking as drawn as he had when the snake venom was climbing toward his heart. "But there's lots of folks in that county who think it would be best if we all just disappeared and this ledger never came back to haunt them." "Shoot first, ask questions later," I said, recalling what the cop had told One-Eyed Jack. "But we're not in Fremont County anymore. Maybe we should just turn ourselves into the police around here and tell them everything we know. Show them all those letters in the pillowcase and that ledger book, and tell them how Emmy doesn't want to be the Black Witch's daughter at all. And how you killed 2 men." It wasn't an accusation, Just a cold reminder of the reality of our situation. He killed to protect himself and us, Mose signed. Couple it with kidnapping, and who's going to believe us? Jail for us all at the very least, Albert said in that dead voice he'd been using since the snakebite. He glanced down at the headline. Maybe worse. We fed that newspaper to the fire. I had earthworms and fishing line, and I rummaged around in the driftwood until I found 3 straight sticks that would serve as poles. While Albert lay in the shade of a huge ash tree whose branches overhung the driftwood wall, Mose and Emmy and I stood on the sand at the river's edge. I'd attached a dry little twig to each line as a bobber. Emmy, who'd grown up on a farm, had no compunction about skewering an earthworm with her hook, and she had her line in the water even before Mose and I did. We fished through the afternoon without a nibble. Finally Mose put down his pole and signed, "I'm going to noodle," which I recalled was how Forrest, the Indian we'd encountered before New Bremen, had said he'd caught the catfish he'd shared with us. Mose wiggled his fingers like worms to give us an image of what he was planning. Then he followed the edge of the island until he came to a place where a great cottonwood had been undercut by the river, and the arcing lacework of the exposed roots formed little caves that were half filled with river water. Mose scooted out along one of the thick roots, laid himself down, reached his hand into the water among the roots, and held it there. I couldn't see his fingers, but I suspected they were wriggly and delectable-looking to a fat catfish. Emmy watched and whispered in a frightened voice, "Will they eat his fingers?" "I guess they'll try," I said, and the image of Hermann Volz and his hand with only 4.5 digits filled my mind. I didn't know about catfish, but I hoped their teeth were a lot more forgiving than those of a bandsaw. Mose was nothing if not patient. He lay on that thick root long after Emmy's attention had drifted, and mine too, and we left him to his noodling and went into the woods that covered the island. The trees were thick with vines, and the ground under the broad reach of the boughs was covered with brush. Emmy and I made our way slowly. I told her we were exploring the island because we were vagabonds on an adventure. "To kill the witch," Emmy said. "And all the other monsters who threaten children," I proclaimed. I grabbed a vine and pulled it loose from the trunk where it had hung, and I tried to swing, in the way Johnny Weissmuller had done in Tarzan the Ape Man, which was one of the few movies I'd been allowed to see in the theater in Lincoln. The vine broke under my weight. I came crashing down and landed in the middle of a clump of sumac, square on my butt. I sat for a moment, a little stunned, and heard Emmy calling my name with concern. Then I turned and looked down and screamed. The mouth of a skeleton next to me hung open in a ghastly smile of greeting. Chapter 36. Mose came running. A minute later, Albert was there too, but looking weak and winded. They stood beside Emmy and me. I'd leapt away from that macabre grin as fast as I could, and we all gaped at our only companion on the island. It was a full skeleton, completely intact, head to bony toes. Tendrils of vegetation grew up between its ribs and vined out the empty eye sockets. Like the driftwood piled on the tip of the island, the bones were bleached to a ghostly white. For a long while, we simply stared. Finally, Mose signed, "Who?" Albert said, "No telling." "It's not very big," I noted. "About your size," Albert agreed. "A kid," Mose signed. "What do you suppose it's doing here?" I asked. "Just like the driftwood, maybe," Albert said. "The river dropped it here." I crept near the skeleton again, less afraid now, and knelt and examined our companion more carefully. "Look!" I pointed to the side of its skull, to an indentation surrounded by a spiderwebbing of cracks. "I'm no cop, but I'd bet somebody whacked this kid on the head." "Murder," Mose signed. "I wouldn't jump to any conclusions," Albert said. I spotted something lying at the feet of the skeleton and picked it up. Dark brown and brittle, it almost fell apart in my hand, but we could all see what it was. "A moccasin," Emmy said. "An Indian kid," I said, and I thought about Billy Redsleeve. "What do we do?" "Nothing," Albert said. I looked at him. The shell of him, anyway. He might have been just too exhausted to care, still recovering from his ordeal with the snakebite. But I thought it went deeper. In New Bremen, he'd had one foot in the grave. Death had looked him in the eye, and I think he was still afraid. "Nothing?" Mose signed, and I could see a rare fury rising in him. "Whatever happened was a long time ago," Albert said in a tired voice. "Who knows? Maybe 100 years ago. There's nothing anyone can do about it now." I couldn't get out of my head the image of Billy Redsleeve, lying so long forgotten in the quarry where DeMarco had thrown his little body. "We can't just leave it." "What do you suggest?" Albert's words were stone cold now. "That we alert the authorities? What a good idea that would be." "We bury him," Mose signed. "I'm not going to handle those bones," Albert said. Mose, who was almost never confrontational, faced my brother and signed angrily. "He was an Indian kid like me. If I'd died in that ditch with my mother, I would have wanted a decent burial. So we give him a decent burial. I'll handle the bones." Mose and I used sticks scrounged from the driftwood wall to dig a hole in the soft dirt. 3 feet down, water began to seep through the soil, and we stopped. Mose carried the skeleton in pieces and set the bones in the little grave, arranged more or less as we'd found them, so that what was left of the Indian child appeared to be lying in repose. Before we covered the bones with dirt, Mose signed, "Say something, Odie." My first thought was, why me? But it was obvious that Albert wasn't interested, and this was what Mose wanted. "This kid," I began, "was just like us. He loved the sun on his face, the dew on the morning grass, the song of birds in the trees. He loved to skip stones on the river. At night, he liked to lie on the sand and stare up at the stars and dream, just like us. He had people who loved him. But one day he went away and never came back, and they were heartbroken. They vowed not to speak his name again until the day he returned. That day never came. But every night his mother stood on the riverbank and called his name. And if you listen close at night, you can still hear the wind over the river whisper that name. So he will never be forgotten." "What name, Odie?" Emmy asked. "Listen to the wind tonight," I said. Mose bent over the grave and signed, "I will never forget you." And he began to cover the bones with dirt. Mose, it turned out, had been successful in his noodling, and he brought to our little camp 2 fat catfish for dinner. He cleaned them with Albert's scout knife, and just as we'd seen Forrest do nearly 2 weeks before, threaded them on sticks thrust into the sand and tilted over the fire to cook. We ate the fish with bread I'd bought at the village market, and we split a Hershey's bar for dessert. After dark, we sat around the fire, staring into the flames, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I was brooding about Albert, who was only a ghost of himself, but because of the skeleton we'd buried, I was also thinking about my father, who'd been laid in a pauper's grave in the cemetery in Lincoln. As far as I knew, there'd been no service for him. They just threw him into the hole and covered him up. I'd seen his grave twice. The first time was a perfunctory visit in the company of Mr. Brickman not long after Albert and I landed at the Lincoln Indian Training School. He showed us the grave, then stood away to give us a few minutes alone, and finally whisked us back to the school. I hadn't reacted much during that visit, nor had Albert. We just stood staring down at the little marker planted in the earth like an isolated paving stone. I didn't cry, or even feel like crying under Brickman's impatient gaze. The second time was on my 12th birthday. I'd pretty much forgotten what my mother looked like by then, and my father's face had begun to fade as well. I wanted desperately not to forget him, so I slipped away from the school and returned to the cemetery. I had some trouble finding his marker because the pauper's grave hadn't been well cared for, and weeds had grown up and obscured the stone. I knelt and cleared away the wild growth and read the name on the marker, which was all there was, a name, and spent an hour remembering everything I could about him. He'd been a man who liked music and liked to laugh. I remembered that whenever he bent to hug me, his cheek against mine was rough with stubble. He'd read us stories when we went to bed at night, and his voice had changed and become the voices of different characters. I think now that under other circumstances, he might have been an actor. What he'd been was a bootlegger, and after my mother died, he'd been a runner for other, more powerful bootleggers. He'd been raised in the hills of the Ozarks, where making corn liquor was a time-honored tradition, and he hadn't been ashamed of how he earned his living. He'd brought us from Missouri up to Minnesota on a liquor run, and we'd camped along the Gilead River just outside Lincoln. That night, Albert and I had stayed by the river while my father drove his Model T pickup into town to make his delivery. He never returned. The sheriff's people came for us, and that's when we learned the truth of his death. He'd been shot in the back and left for dead. They never explained a motive, never identified a suspect. My father was just a crook and had met a crook's end. And Albert and I were the sons of a crook, and our sentence was life under the Black Witch's thumb. Why 2 white boys in a school for Indian kids? Thelma Brickman had always explained it this way. We offered to take you in because the state school for orphans is already full. You should be grateful that you're not begging on the streets. But Cora Frost had told us that the Brickmans got a monthly check from the state for our care. Although my mother was a vague shade in my past, I still remembered my father, and Albert remembered him too, and we knew where we'd come from, and that we had family in St. Louis, an aunt who tried to send us money, to take care of us in the only way she could. Emmy remembered both of her parents, and even had a photograph to help keep them fresh in her mind. But when I looked at Mose, who was deep in serious thought as he gazed into the flames, I realized he probably remembered no one. And I thought of what Sister Eve had said when she told me about what each of us was seeking, and that Mose was looking for who he was. We lay down early that night. Emmy and Albert went right to sleep, but I lay awake. Mose couldn't sleep either, and after a while he got up and walked past the low flames still flickering among the coals of the fire, and went to the river's edge and sat alone. I let him be for a spell, then rolled out of my blanket and joined him. I didn't want to disturb the others, so I signed, "What are you doing?" After a long while, he finally signed, "Listening." The water, as it ran against the sand, murmured, and from the woods behind us came the song of tree frogs, and every once in a while the fire popped. A soft wind blew across the river valley, but all I heard from it was a rustling among the trees on the island. "I have a name," Mose signed. "Moses," I signed back. He shook his head. "Sioux name," he signed, then spelled out Amdacha. "How do you know?" Sister Eve held my hand and told me. "What does it mean?" "Broken to pieces. Named after a great uncle. A warrior." I listened to the shivering of the trees in the night wind, and remembered the story Jack had told us about the stars inside cottonwoods, and how the spirit of the night sky shook the trees to set them loose. The spirit must have wanted stars that night, because the sky was a-glitter with 1,000,000 pinpoints of light. "Should I call you Broken to Pieces now?" Before he could answer, we heard a commotion behind us, and Albert cried out, "It's Emmy!" He held her as she spasmed in his arms. Mose and I sat with him, and we each took one of her hands, and Emmy's pain was ours too. These spells never went on long, but they racked her whole small body, and it was torture watching. When the episode had passed and she'd gone limp, her eyes opened and she said, "They're dead. They're all dead." "Who, Emmy?" "I couldn't help them," she said. "I tried, but I couldn't. It was already done." "Is she talking about the Indian kid?" I asked. "More than one," Albert noted. "She said they're all dead." I looked down at Emmy, whose eyes were open but glazed. "Are there more dead kids on this island, Emmy?" "I tried." There's nothing I could do." "Tried what?" Albert asked. She didn't answer, just closed her eyes and fell into a deep sleep. We wrapped her in her blanket and sat with her as the last of the flames from our little fire died out, leaving only the dull glow of red coals. "They're all dead," I said, repeating Emmy's words. What did she mean? Albert stirred the fire with a stick. "What she says in her fits always sounds like nonsense." "Maybe isn't," Mose sighed. He turned and peered at the dark stand of trees that covered the island and hid God knew what. "This place is giving me the creeps," I said. "I think we should leave." Mose nodded and signed, "First thing in the morning." What little sleep I got that night was restless, and although I didn't remember them exactly, my dreams were full of menace. When the sky began to show signs of morning, Mose and I got up, and in the cool blue of first light, packed our things and loaded the canoe. Albert tried to help, but wasn't much use. Emmy was sunk in such a profound slumber that she didn't stir as Mose lifted her and laid her gently in the canoe. Albert sat in the middle, the position he'd occupied before his snakebite, and I took the bow. Mose shoved us off the island and stepped into the stern, and we lifted our paddles. Although we didn't know it yet, the current of the Minnesota River was sweeping us toward revelations that would open our eyes to a darkness even greater than the Black Witch. Chapter 37. There were no railroad tracks shadowing this stretch of river, and for a significant distance, no towns, and along the banks only thick stands of trees, so no prying eyes to discover us. We made good distance that first morning. Emmy had awakened in the peach light of dawn with, as usual, no recollection of her spell the night before. She seemed refreshed and full of smiles, and both her spirits and her lively conversations with Peter Rabbit buoyed me and even seemed to lift Albert's spirits. Mose, of course, was silent, but something came from him that told me he was still in that dark place he'd gone after our discovery of the Indian kid's skeleton. Near noon, we pulled up to the bank where a little brook emptied into the silty brown river, and we ate the last of the food I'd bought at the village market. "How long do you reckon we've been gone from Lincoln School?" I asked Albert. He was slow answering. "A month, give or take a day or two." "How long before we reach the Mississippi?" "Days," he said with a heavy sigh. "And how long after that before we reach St. Louis?" "Weeks. Months. I don't know." "Months? That's forever." "Would you rather be working Bledsoe's hayfields?" "I'd rather be eating at the Morrow House and sleeping in one of their soft beds." Emmy sighed, but not sadly, a kind of pixie sound. "I'd rather be a princess riding on the back of a swan." "And eating nothing but ice cream," I added. She held up her sock puppet. "With chocolate sauce," Peter Rabbit said in a little rabbit voice. "What about you, Mose?" I asked. He'd put his back to the rest of us and was chucking stones at the river, flinging them hard so that they hit the water with little explosions. He didn't respond. "Come on," I said. "What would you rather be doing?" He turned toward me, and what I saw in his face scared me. He signed, "Tracking down my mother's killer." Which brought an end to the game. We stayed on the river until late afternoon and made camp on a little strip of beach at the base of a rock bluff. I tried my hand at fishing again, and this time had some success, pulling in a big something that definitely wasn't a catfish. I made a spit over our fire that night and skewered and roasted the fish. Its firm white flesh came easily off the bone and tasted far better than any catfish I'd ever eaten. I didn't understand until much later that I'd landed a walleye, a prized catch in Minnesota. As night came on, we could see a glow in the east as if from a fire. I'd observed the same sort of phenomenon once when we camped with our father south of Omaha, and the distant city had lit up the night sky. "Mankato?" I asked Albert. "That's my guess," he said. "We're not very far. We'll be there in the morning." Albert shook his head. We'll stay here until tomorrow afternoon. Then we'll pass through at dusk. Less chance of being spotted." That was the kind of plan the old Albert would have put forward, and I found it encouraging. Except that it meant we'd have to wait in the company of Mose, whose foul mood, the first I'd ever seen him in, weighed on us all. I thought maybe my harmonica would help, so I hauled it out and played some lively tunes that I knew were among Mose's favorites. But the hard shell he'd put around himself didn't crack, and even when Emmy danced a little jig that was cute as hell, Mose showed no emotion at all. In its way, his brooding was as alarming as one of Emmy's fits. The next morning found us all in bad spirits. When I'd cleaned the walleye, I'd left the mess of its innards on the sand at the river's edge, and a storm of black flies descended, attacking not only the fish leavings, but us as well. Albert swore at me, and I swore back, and Emmy broke into tears, which brought out the protective side of Mose, and he signed at Albert and me so vehemently I thought he'd break his hands. "I'm not sitting around here all day with you," I snapped at Albert. "Fine," he shot back. "Why don't you swim to St. Louis?" I took off, storming along the bluff, then through a copse of birch trees, heading away from the river. In the night, I'd heard the sound of freight cars clattering over rails to the south, and also the far-off howl of an engine horn. I made my way to the tracks, which were less than a quarter of a mile distant, and followed them toward the city whose glow we'd seen in the night. The whole way I cursed my brother and the bad luck that had made us desert Sister Eve, and I railed at the weeks or months or who knew, even years before we'd reach St. Louis, if we ever did. I knew cops everywhere were looking for Emmy, and if they caught us, our gooses were cooked but good. I thought maybe I wouldn't go back to the others. Maybe I was better off on my own. I walked for a couple of hours and finally reached Mankato, where both the river and the railroad took a dramatic turn toward the north. The city, with a population of thousands, lay along both sides of the river's curl. Warehouses and industrial buildings stood in big blocks at the river's edge. A long, high, tree-lined bluff rose behind the city, and along the flat at the base of the bluff lay the downtown business district, where I'd once dogged Sid and had spied on him as he met and paid the people who traveled with the crusade, and had been healed time and again. I made my way into that busy center of commerce. Automobiles zipped down the streets, and after the long quiet of my canoe journey, their beep and rattle felt like an assault. The midday was humid, the air stifling, and the unpleasant odor of hot tar hung over everything. I'd been to cities before, St. Louis, Omaha, Kansas City, but that had been so long ago that I had no real recollection of them. The time I'd spent in Mankato following Sid had been so brief that I didn't have a clear sense of the place. After years in Lincoln, which was a small town, and our time in New Bremen, which was only slightly larger, I felt I was standing in an alien, unwelcoming land. And I was alone. That's what hit me most. I was all alone. In my anger at Albert, this was what I'd wanted. But when I understood the reality of it, my heart sank, and I longed to be with my family again. I'd just made my decision to hightail it back to our camp, when I heard a commotion up one of the streets, and curiosity got the better of me. I followed the sound of raised voices, turned a corner, and found myself at the edge of a crowd gathered in front of the local armory. Cops prowled the perimeter, and I'd have turned away immediately but for the promise that came with the smell of hot soup, and even better, the yeasty aroma of fresh-baked bread. I couldn't see the food because of the wall of bodies in front of me. I could, however, see a man standing on the steps of the armory, well above the heads of the crowd, and he was shouting through a megaphone. "Hey, you fellas," he hollered. "How many of you slogged through French mud or sat hip-deep in stinking trench water or threw yourselves down on Jerry barbed wire?" His question was answered with encouraging shouts and cheers. "And how many of you saw your comrades in arms slaughtered before your very eyes?" This didn't get such an agreeable response, but it sent an audible ripple through the crowd. "And what did they promise those of us who were lucky enough to come back? They promised us bonuses for our service, compensation for the horrors we witnessed or were a part of. But they told us we'd have to wait for our money. Well, we can't wait. We don't have jobs now, do we?" There was a resounding chorus of no, which made sense given the state of the clothing most of the crowd wore. "And we have no roofs over our heads, and we don't have food to feed ourselves or our families, do we?" This really got to the crowd, and they raised their fisted hands and shouted, "No! We need that money now, today, not years down the road. Hell, we'll all have starved to death by then. Are you with me?" Judging from the roar of approval the crowd delivered, they were. That's when the cops swept in. They came out of the side streets and the alleys carrying truncheons and shoving their way among the crowd, dividing them into islands of confusion, sending them running every which way. "You, Mr. Cop, did you fight in France?" the man with the megaphone called out. But I guessed not, because the policeman he'd addressed simply whacked him on the head with his billy club, and I saw him tumble. Chaos engulfed the scene, and I found myself buffeted by fleeing bodies and thrown against a brick wall. I crawled into the safety of an alcove that was the entrance to a printing shop, where I cowered until the street had emptied, and a man poked his head out the door of the shop and snapped, "Get on, boy! Don't be loitering here!" I quickly headed back to the railroad tracks and followed them out of the city, eager to return to the place where I'd left my brother and Emmy and Mose, wanting more than anything to be in the safety of my family again, surrounded by the comfort of our love. Sure, we sometimes got angry and yelled at one another, but we never swung billy clubs. By the time I found where I'd joined the tracks that morning, it was late afternoon and the shadows were long across the land. I made my way down to the river, to the rock bluff where we'd stayed the night, my heart singing at the prospect of rejoining the others. But when I reached the strip of beach where we'd camped, I was still alone. Everyone had gone. Chapter 38. I spent my 24th birthday hunkered down inside the shell of a burned-out cafe in Brest, France, with German bullets cutting the air around me. I was scared, but, honestly, not nearly as frightened as I'd been when I was 12 years old standing on that empty beach on the bank of the Minnesota River, thinking I'd lost the only family I had. The remains of the fire still smoldered, and the sand still held the impressions of our bodies where we'd slept in the night. But the beach was empty. My first thought was that Albert had been so angry he'd convinced the others to abandon me. But he was my brother, and we'd been at each other's throats before. He wouldn't just desert me, no matter how far I'd pushed him. I looked for a sign, a trail marker of some kind like the one Mose had left earlier on the Gilead. I found nothing like that, but I did discover something disturbing. Large footprints in the wet sand at the river's edge, larger even than Mose would have left. And then I looked carefully at all the footprints. Emmy's were small and easy to spot. Albert and Mose wore Red Wing boots of the same size, and their prints, though larger, were exactly like those my boots made. But there were other shoe prints, man-size, and the paw prints of dogs. Someone had been there. Several someones. Something had happened, and Albert and Mose and Emmy had been forced to flee. But flee where? I looked at the river, the brown current pushing east toward Mankato, and I figured there was only one way for them to go. The rest of the afternoon I followed the course of the river all the way back to the outskirts of Mankato with no sign of my family. It was dusk by then. I was tired and hungry and discouraged. I'd convinced myself that my brother and Mose and Emmy hadn't fled the beach, but had instead been caught. The Black Witch had worked some kind of dark magic and had tracked them down. I'd been gone when the capture had taken place, but that didn't mean I was lucky. It meant that I was absolutely alone. I came to a trestle that crossed another river, a tributary to the Minnesota. A couple of 100 yards north, I could see the place where the rivers met. I sat on the cross ties and dangled my feet and tried to make sense of my situation. Albert and Mose were probably already behind bars, and I considered simply giving myself up. What could they do to me? Did they put 12-year-olds in the electric chair? If that's where Albert was going, then maybe that's where I was going too. we would meet our end together. I'd crawled deep into a hole of misery when I heard something that made my heart sing a little. From among the trees downstream came the reedy voice of a harmonica. I knew the tune, Arkansas Traveler. I took my own instrument from my shirt pocket and began to play a counterpoint to the melody. The other voice paused, as if surprised, then picked up the tune and we played together to the end. I climbed down from the trestle and headed toward the trees from which the music had come. At the place where the two rivers met stood a community of temporary shelters. The little structures had been built of materials you might have found in a city dump: cardboard, sheet metal, corrugated siding, scrap lumber, wooden crates. There were lean-tos of driftwood covered with tarps. Here and there, a tent had been pitched, but mostly it was a village predicated on desperate necessity, given shape and substance by the discards of those who were better off. Fires burned in cut-down barrels or in the open, and I could smell food cooking. The voice of the harmonica kept calling. I wove along pathways between the shelters, where folks looked up from their fires or peered at me from the entryways of their hovels. I came at last to what looked like a big teepee, a cone of long branches covered with canvas. It stood in the high grass that edged the big river. Near the teepee sat an old pickup truck whose bed was jammed with furniture and whatnot. In front of the teepee door was a stone fire ring with a nice blaze going at its center, and a big black cook pot hung over the flames. 3 adults sat on low crates around the fire, one of them a squat, balding man with sun-darkened skin and a harmonica to his lips. Their faces turned toward me, and the man lowered his mouth organ. They stared, not with hostility, but as if with an expectation of what they knew would come next. "I play too," I said feebly, and showed him my harmonica. "That was you a while ago?" he asked. "Uh-huh." A woman sat next to him. I judged them to be about the same age, the age my parents would have been, but her face seemed far more careworn than his. Her hair hung about her shoulders in limp blonde strings badly in need of washing. She wore a flour-sack dress, old but of a colorful pattern, with ballerinas and butterflies. Her feet were shod in beat-to-hell work boots, and as far as I could tell, she wore no socks. But the one who commanded my attention was a woman of great age, a loose construct of folds and wrinkles out of which 2 dark eyes studied me intently. She wore a shawl over an old dress that came to her ankles, and the stem of a corncob pipe was lodged in the corner of her mouth. "Are you alone?" she asked in a voice surprisingly gentle. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Folks?" "Don't have any." "Orphan?" the younger, careworn woman said. "Yes, ma'am." "Are you with somebody here?" the old woman asked. "No, ma'am. Just came in on the railroad tracks up there." "Awfully young to be a hobo," the other woman said. "Lots of young ones on their own these days, Sarah," the old woman said. "Hard times for all. Have you eaten, son?" "I ate a bit this morning." "You're welcome to join us. Soup's almost ready." "Mother Beale," the man said. "We can spare the boy some soup, Powell," the old woman said. All the wrinkles on the lower part of her face formed themselves into a smile. "And then maybe he can pay us back with some music." What I would come to learn in time was that Powell Schofield, his wife Sarah, and his mother-in-law Alice Beale had lost their farm in Scott County, Kansas, and had set out for Chicago, where Mother Beale had family and Schofield hoped to find work. Their truck engine had begun to act up, and they had no money for repairs, no money for anything, even gas, and they'd been in the thrown-together village, which they told me was called Hooverville, for more than a week. There were Hoovervilles everywhere, another thing I learned later. Like many of the men in the encampment, Schofield had heard there was work to be had in the canneries in the area, a report that had turned out to be terribly untrue. Now they were stuck. Mrs. Schofield stirred the soup in the black pot and said, "Powell, will you round up Maybeth and the children? Tell them supper's ready. And tell Captain Gray he's welcome to join us if he brings his own spoon and bowl." The man stood. He wasn't big, but was powerful-looking, his chest and arms muscled from the work of a farmer. He trudged off among the makeshift abodes, heading toward the sound of kids playing, which I'd heard on my arrival. Mother Beale eyed me carefully. "Buck Jones, eh?" Because that's what I'd told them when they asked my name. I was growing rather fond of it. "Like the cowboy movie star?" "Yes, ma'am." "Uh-huh," she said, and looked me up and down. "Those clothes are awfully nice. And if I'm not mistaken, those boots are Red Wing, not far from new. A suspicious mind might think you're a runaway." Which I was, sort of, though more of an escapee. "No family to run away from," I said. "My father died 4 years ago. My mother a couple of years before that." "No other family?" "An aunt in St. Louis. That's where we're going." "I'm going," I corrected. "St. Louis is a long way," she said. "Weeks and weeks," I agreed. "And just you and no other resources?" "Just me." Mrs. Schofield tasted the soup and added a pinch of something from a little bag she took out of her dress pocket. "That sounds awfully—" She paused with her hand over the steaming cauldron. "Brave," she finally said. Mother Beale laughed. "Plumb crazy is what I was thinking. But look where 70 years of judicious living has got me." She took the pipe from her mouth and swung the stem in a long arc that encompassed all the flimsy shelters of Hooverville. "And look at them. Most folks here had no idea this was just around the corner. So much is beyond anyone's control." She smiled at me. "So, Buck, I'm the last person to tell you whatever you got in mind is crazy. All I'm going to say is, God be with you." Mr. Schofield returned with 3 children in tow, one of them a girl no older than I. She wore a boy's shirt and a boy's dungarees, patched in several places, and her feet were bare. She smiled shyly at me and went immediately to work, helping her mother with the final meal preparations. This was Maybeth Schofield, and despite the boy's clothing, I thought she was the prettiest girl I'd ever seen. The other 2 were twins, 8 years old, Lester and Lydia. Some distance behind them trailed a tall figure, limping his way toward the fire. When he came from the shadow of the trees and fully into the evening light, I realized I'd seen him before. He'd been the man with the megaphone exhorting the other veterans in the crowd to rise up and demand the bonuses that had been promised them for their military service. A dark bruise spread across the side of his face, and I remembered watching the cop clobber him with a billy club. But that didn't explain his limp. "Lost it in the Argonne," he said, tapping his right pant leg, which produced a wooden sound. We were eating by then, and that's when I learned much of the history of the Schofields and Captain Bob Gray. Maybeth sat with the twins on the other side of the fire. Her hair was the color of her mother's, the soft gold of the alfalfa after it had sun-dried in Bledsoe's fields, but softer looking and cleaner than her mother's. Whenever I caught her looking at me, she would quickly look away. For a reason I couldn't have explained then, that simple, demure gesture captured my heart. "The rain didn't come the way it was supposed to," Mr. Schofield said. He'd finished his soup, a tasty concoction of chicken broth and vegetables, and threw a stick angrily on the fire. "Last 2 years, the corn just didn't come up. Had nothing to feed my livestock. It was all skin and bones. Bank told me to go to hell when I asked for more credit. Then they took the farm. The bastards." "There was a little more to it than that," Mother Beale said. "Yeah, well, that was the crux." He stood abruptly. "I got things to see to." And he strode off into the dark under the trees. Mother Beale watched him go. "Drought, he says." "Mama," Mrs. Schofield cautioned her. "I'm just saying there were farmers around us who found a way." Captain Gray, that's what he preferred to be called, was on a mission of his own making, attempting to recruit men to travel with him to Washington, D.C., to join the thousands of other veterans gathering there to demand payment of the promised bonuses. There are plenty of us here in Minnesota desperate for that money. It's no handout we're asking for. It's what was promised. A government should keep its promises. I don't know why a government would behave any differently from the people who comprise it, Mother Beale said around the stem of her pipe. When it comes to money, people often behave in ungracious and ungrateful ways. After the meal was finished, Mother Beale said, "Children, help us clean up. Buck, you promised us a tune on that mouth organ of yours." "You play the harmonica?" Captain Gray asked. "Got me a squeeze box back at my shack. Mind if I play along?" "That'd be all right," I said. "Can I help clean up?" I asked Sarah Schofield. "Obliged, Buck, but we can handle this. You figure what you're going to play." I watched May Beth help her mother. She gave instructions to the littler ones with a maternal patience, and she moved with a cat-like grace, and for some reason I couldn't name, her bare feet, slender and brown from the sun and from the dirt, seemed especially beautiful. I tried to think of a song that might impress her. I wanted something lovely and lyrical, but also a little sad and lonely, because that's what I'd been feeling, and I wanted her to understand. I finally settled on Shenandoah. When Captain Gray returned, he brought not only his concertina, but also a large scrap of white wood on which Hooverville had been painted in large black letters. That word had been crossed out with red paint, and below it was now the word Hopersville. "This sign's been hanging on the tree next to my shack for way too long," Captain Gray said. "I thought it was time we called this place something brighter. What do you think, Mother Beale?" "I think it's perfect, Captain Gray," she replied. We played some tunes together. My repertoire was broader than his, but we knew a few of the same melodies, and as we played, folks came away from their own little places and gathered around the fire. And a kind of miracle happened, or what I thought of then as a miracle. One man brought out a sack of ginger cookies and passed them around to the children who were there. Someone else offered up a jug of cider. Apple slices appeared and some cheese and bread. And while Captain Gray and I played, and a few of the folks who knew the tunes sang along, the people in the gathering, none of whom had much, found a way to feed one another. Mrs. Schofield finally said, "It's late, and the children need to be abed." "One more," I said. "Something special." "All right, but just one." I played Shenandoah, just as I'd planned. At the end, I looked across the fire at Maybeth Schofield. Her eyes were two blue pearls wet, as if with dew, and when she smiled at me, my heart cracked wide open. Chapter 39. Before Lydia and Lester were put to bed inside the Schofields' teepee, Mother Beale brought out a Bible, an old edition, bound in fine leather of a mahogany color and with pages edged in gold. "Can you read, Buck?" "Yes, ma'am." "Would you care to read a passage to end our day? It's what we do in our family. Despite what must seem like desperate circumstances, we don't believe the Lord has deserted us." I'd begun my journey on the Gilead with a profound belief in God, but a different kind of God, one that rained terror. I hadn't let go of my fear that such a God was out there, dark and powerful and waiting, a shepherd who ate his flock. But Sister Eve had given me a different image to consider, and when Mother Beale handed me the Bible, I didn't feel at all like a fraud when I read from it. I chose the 23rd Psalm, because it was the passage most familiar to me. After I'd finished, Mother Beale said, "Mighty appropriate, Buck, given our current situation." "Good night, children." Mrs. Schofield ushered her two younger ones into the teepee. Before I returned the Bible to Mother Beale, I saw pages in the very front with names and dates handwritten. "Our family tree," the old woman explained. She scooted her crate next to the one on which I sat and drew a finger down each page, elucidating her lineage, from the first name and date, Ezra Hornsby, September 21st, 1804, to the most recent names, Lester and Lydia Schofield, May 18th, 1924. Among the things I learned was an explanation for the teepee. Her father, Simon Hornsby, had been an Episcopal missionary among the Sioux in the Dakota Territory, which was where she'd been raised and had learned the beauty and utility of that simple construct. I stared at those pages, which were a solid map of family, and I was envious. These people knew who they were, where they'd come from, and understood the larger fabric into which their lives had been woven. Me? I felt like I was dangling out there, a thread all alone. Mother Beale laid the Bible on her lap. "Where do you intend to pass the night?" I'd been so caught up in the flow of the evening that I hadn't thought about it at all. "I guess maybe I'll bed down in the tall grass somewhere." "Maybeth, go get a blanket and give it to Buck." "No, ma'am, I couldn't," I said. "You can and you will. Maybeth?" The girl went into the teepee and returned with a folded wool blanket. Before she could give it to me, her father stumbled into the firelight and sat down heavily on a crate. His eyes were dazed in a way I recognized, and the smell of whiskey was on him strong. Mother Beale said, "And what did you use to buy it?" "What?" he said, in a terrible attempt at innocence. She stared him down, and he lowered his eyes. "My mouth organ. A trade." Mrs. Schofield came from the teepee and saw her husband bent contritely at the fire. I thought she'd light into him, but she drew him into her arms. He laid his head on her shoulder, as a child might with his mother, and closed his eyes. She gave Mother Beale a look I couldn't at that age interpret, but I have since come to think of as profound maternal compassion, a strength emanating from a deep well of endurance that across my life I've come to understand was not particular to Sarah Schofield. I've witnessed it in other women who have suffered much without losing their hope, or their gift for embracing with forgiveness those who were broken. "Let's go to bed, sweetheart," she said, and led him inside the teepee. "Maybeth, why don't you help Buck find a soft spot for the night?" Mother Beale said. "I'll wait here for you. Don't be long." We walked out of the firelight, but not far because there was only a quarter moon in the sky and the night was rather dark. The high grass of the riverbank gave way to sand, and I found a spot a few dozen yards from the Schofields' encampment and laid the blanket out on the beach. The stars were legion, and the Milky Way was a soft, blurry arc across the heavens. "I'll stay a bit if you like," Maybeth offered. "It's kind of scary out here." "I'm not afraid." "I didn't think so," she said. We sat on the blanket, and Maybeth crossed her legs and rubbed the patch that covered one knee. "I had a nice dress," she said, "blue, but I gave it away." "Why?" "Janie Baldwin needed it more. She was picking strawberries from a garden in town. Stealing them, really, and a dog attacked her. Tore her dress almost completely off her. The Baldwins, well, they're worse off than we are." "Your family's nice." She looked back toward the glow of the fire. "I worry about Papa." I thought of my own father and how he'd made his living supplying the whiskey for men like Powell Schofield. I wasn't sure what to do with that. "There's my star," she said, pointing toward the upper glimmer in the cup of the Big Dipper. "Your star? You own it?" "I claimed it. There are more stars in the sky than people on Earth, so there are plenty to go around. I claimed that one, because if you follow the line that connects it with the one below, you'll find the North Star. It helps me know where I'm going. What star is yours?" "The one below," I said. "The one that connects and helps show the way." We gazed at our stars until Maybeth said, "I better go back." "Thank you for the blanket." I thought she would leave then, but she stayed a moment longer. "How old are you?" 13, I said. It was almost true. "Me too." Do you know Romeo and Juliet? Shakespeare? Because of Cora Frost, I knew about the playwright. I vaguely knew the storyline. Two people who were in love, and it didn't turn out particularly well for them. Juliet was 13, and Romeo wasn't much older, she said. People married young back then, I guess. Watching her across the fire earlier that evening, I'd thought about kissing Maybeth Schofield and had tried to imagine how that might feel. Good night, good night. Parting is such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night till it be morrow. In the quiet after she spoke, I stared at the river, a ghostly starlit flow before me, and thought again what it would be like to kiss Maybeth Schofield. Buck? I turned my face to hers, and she leaned to me and pressed her lips against mine for the briefest of moments. Then she stood and ran back to her family's camp. I lay that night staring up at the two stars that would forever be connected in my thinking, filled with a fire that was completely new to me and whose burn was not pain but infinite pleasure. Maybeth, I said aloud, and there seemed such a sweetness on my tongue. Then I thought about Albert and Mose and Emmy, and once again I was afraid, terrified that maybe I'd lost them forever. It wasn't just fear that stabbed at me, but guilt as well, because for a little while, in the company of the Schofields, I'd forgotten them. What kind of brother was I? Morning came early in the newly dubbed Hopersville. When I rolled over in my blanket, I could smell the cook fires already burning. I sat up, looked at the river, a broad reflection of a rose-colored sky, and I knew what I had to do that day. Mrs. Schofield had her own cook fire going. A black pot half filled with water hung over the flames, and a sooted coffee pot had been set among the embers at the fire's edge. No one else seemed to be up yet, and Mrs. Schofield sat alone with a steaming blue enamel cup in her hand. She smiled at me. "Are you always an early riser, Buck?" "When I have things to do," I said. "Do you drink coffee?" I didn't, but I was almost 13, old enough to marry, at least in the old days, and I figured I must be old enough for coffee, too. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Grab yourself a cup from that red crate in the back of the truck." The tailgate was down, and on it sat the red crate, which contained cups and plates and flatware and pots and pans. The rest of the pickup bed was jammed full of everything else the Schofields had brought with them from Kansas. I took one of the cups from the crate, and Mrs. Schofield filled it from the blackened coffee pot. The brew was bitter and not at all to my liking, but I smiled as if it were ambrosia and thanked her. "So you have a plan, Buck?" "There are some friends I have to find." "Around here?" "Maybe," I said. "I hope." "Where are you going to look?" I'd thought about that much of the night. If the cops had somehow apprehended my family, they were near enough to Mankato that I thought that's where they might have been taken for processing. I intended to visit the police department and find out for sure. Beyond that, I didn't have much of a plan. "Around," I said. "Big place, that. Might they be here in Hopersville?" "I doubt it, ma'am. If they'd heard me playing my harmonica, they'd have come running." Mother Beale emerged from the teepee, her long gray hair all mussed from a night's sleep. So early in the morning, she looked like an old tree bent and battered by a storm. She straightened her back, and it was like firecrackers popping. When she saw me, she smiled. "Sleep well?" "Yes, ma'am. Thanks again for the blanket." "It's what people do, Buck. Help one another." My, that coffee smells wonderful." Maybeth was up next. She must have brushed her hair before she came out, because it was long and soft and didn't look at all slept on. The sun had just risen. The light of the new day broke through the trees, and I saw Maybeth drenched in gold, and my heart leapt. "What can I do, Mama?" she asked. "We'll need oatmeal and molasses," Mrs. Schofield said. Maybeth headed toward the truck, and Mother Beale said, "She might need some help, Buck." We stood at the dropped tailgate, and Maybeth said, "I dreamed about you last night. Did you dream about me?" "Yes." It wasn't exactly a lie, because although I hadn't actually dreamed about her, I'd certainly thought about her a good deal, and had imagined more kisses. "That box," she said, pointing. "Could you pull it out here?" It was corrugated cardboard, filled with canned goods and jarred preserves of all kinds, none of it store-bought. "You made this stuff?" I asked. "Mostly Mama and Mother Beale, but I helped. Most of it came from our garden in Kansas." She drew out a jar of amber-colored liquid, the molasses. "And that box." She pointed toward another, and when I pulled it onto the tailgate, she took out a round box of Quaker Oats. The twins had risen by then, but it was a while before Mr. Schofield made his appearance. By then Mother Beale had said grace, and we were eating. Without a word, Mr. Schofield sat beside his wife, and she ladled out hot cereal for him. "Buck," he said, "I wonder if I could have your help today." "Whatever for?" Mother Beale asked. "I'm going to give a shot to fixing that truck engine." I saw Mrs. Schofield and Mother Beale exchange a look, but they said nothing. "I don't know a lot about engines," I said. "Me neither, Buck. But if I don't get her running, we'll never make it to Chicago." I thought about Albert, who could probably have worked magic on the broken engine, and that made me think about the mission I'd set for myself that day, one I was afraid might be hopeless. "Powell," Mother Beale said, "maybe Buck has other plans." "No, ma'am," I said. "I can help." But it was a doomed effort from the beginning. After a couple of hours that served only to set the man to using language that would have done a sailor proud, he gave up. Engine parts lay scattered on the ground, and I thought that if ever there'd been a shot at fixing the truck, it was gone now. Mr. Schofield looked at the result of our labor, shook his head, and said, "I need a drink." Without a word to his family, he walked away under the trees. "Maybeth," Mrs. Schofield said. "I understand, Mama." Maybeth moved to follow him. "May I help?" I offered. Mrs. Schofield gave a nod. We set off together, and in a bit Maybeth took my hand, and although there was still my family to be found, I didn't feel alone anymore. Chapter 40. Hopersville was alive with activity. The hovels may have been makeshift, but the lives they housed were real and vital. Though a lot of the residents in that town of shacks were single men, there were a number of families in the encampment, and the sound of the children's laughter was little different from the sound that might have been heard in a more settled place. Maybeth and I followed her father at a distance. He skirted a rocky, tree-covered hill that rose above Hopersville and followed the railroad tracks into Mankato. It was clear he knew exactly where he was going. We didn't talk, but I felt a profound sense of sadness from Maybeth as she watched the hunched figure of her father. At a dirt road that intersected the tracks, he turned right, and 100 yards farther on, disappeared into the kind of place I knew well. A lot of people would have called it a speakeasy, but my father had always referred to these places as blind pigs. Don't ask me why. Albert and I had accompanied him into dozens as he'd made his deliveries of bootlegged liquor. If Mr. Schofield was the man I was beginning to understand him to be, I figured he wouldn't come out for a long while. Maybeth stood in the morning sun and stared at the shabby wayside. "I don't understand." "My father said that in some men it's a kind of sickness," I told her. "They crave the drink." "That's the real reason we lost the farm," she said. "He blames the weather. He blames the bags. He blames everything and everyone but himself." Her words were angry now, the sadness flown. "He'll be a while," I said. "I've got business in town. Want to come?" In Mankato, I found a newsstand and checked the morning paper. I figured if the authorities had nabbed my family, it would have made headlines. But there was nothing, which didn't necessarily ease my worry. I asked about the sheriff's office and was directed to the county courthouse, an imposing structure with a tall clock tower atop which stood an immense statue representing justice, a blindfolded lady holding a set of scales. Maybeth had been patient as I'd gone about my business, and she'd asked no questions. But now she said, "What are we doing here?" At the edge of the walk that led up to the courthouse steps was a stone bench. We sat down, and I looked deeply into her eyes. "Can I trust you?" Her answer was to lean to me and plant a kiss on my lips, a long one this time. I told her my real name and all that had happened in the last few weeks, everything except for the killings. How do you tell the girl you love that you're a cold-blooded murderer? You think they're in there? If the police picked them up, then maybe. Are you just going to walk right in and ask? I'm not sure. They'll be looking for you, won't they? My name hasn't been in any of the papers, so maybe not. Just by asking, you might give yourself away. She was probably right, and I sat there staring at all that chiseled stone with no idea how to get at the answers inside. I could ask, she said, and I wanted to kiss her again. So I did. It might be dangerous. You could get into big trouble. I want to help. She stood up and smiled down at me. Don't worry. I'll be back. She walked to the courthouse and up the steps, and that huge hall of justice swallowed her whole. I waited a long time, nearly half an hour according to the clock in the courthouse tower. I was sure something had happened to her. She'd asked the wrong question of the wrong people, and now, like my family, she was a prisoner. And it was my fault. I stared at that stone fortress and could think of no good reason to keep myself free. I stood and marched up the sidewalk, up the steps, and was just reaching for the door when Maybeth came back into the light. She took my arm, and we returned to the stone bench. I talked to a woman who works for the police, but she's not police herself, Maybeth said in a conspiratorial tone. She types and stuff. There's something big going on. A manhunt, she called it. But that's all I could get out of her. Nothing about your family. The fear in her face mirrored my own. Are you the manhunt? Manhunt, I thought, and jumped to the conclusion that my worst fear had been realized. They'd grabbed Albert and Mose and Emmy, and now they were looking for me. I guess so. What are you going to do? I can't just leave my family in there. I have to get them out. How? I don't know. I have to think. Let's walk. We made our way along the streets of Mankato. I don't know for how long. Maybeth silent beside me. I beat my brain trying to think how I could spring my family, but I always came back to the fact that I was nobody and had nothing. I should go back, Maybeth finally said. Mama and Mother Beale will be worried. Come on, Odie. Buck, I said. My name is Buck now. At the harshness in my voice, she stepped away. But instead of leaving, she took my hand. When you don't have anything else to believe in, that's when you need to believe in miracles. I looked at her patched pants, her scuffed shoes with their worn-down heels and twine in place of laces, her thin shirt faded nearly white from the sun. I thought about the farm they'd lost in Kansas, and her father right now in a blind pig, probably drinking away what little they still possessed. The Schofields had lost everything, and yet Maybeth still believed in miracles. She tugged gently on my hand. Come with me. We can figure this out together. Where else did I have to go? So I turned with her, and we headed back. Before we got to Hoppersville, however, we came across a monument to a Legion of the Dead. In a small grassy area, set behind the rails of an iron fence, stood a huge slab of granite, smoothed and shaped like the headstone for a grave. Into its face had been chiseled, "Here were hanged 38 Sioux Indians, December 26th, 1862. "Oh, my God," Maybeth said. "That's awful. What happened?" "I don't know." I stared at that gray memorial to some great human cataclysm, and what it brought to mind was Emmy. I thought about what she'd said when she came out of her last fit and before she'd slipped back into a healing sleep. She'd said, "They're dead. They're all dead." It seemed a stretch, but I couldn't help wondering, had this been what she'd seen? And if so, how had she known? Which got me to thinking again about Albert and Mose, and especially about little Emmy. It seemed to me in that terrible moment, standing before such a solid and solemn reminder of tragedy, that all I ever did was let people down. I'd killed Jack. I'd got Albert snake-bit. I'd promised Sister Eve that I'd watch out for Emmy, keep her safe, but she was probably already back in the greedy hands of the Black Witch. And Albert and Mose were rotting in jail, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about any of it. "Come on," Maybeth said, and took my hand. When we returned, we found a tub of hot water near the fire and Mrs. Schofield hanging wet laundry on a line strung between two trees. Like everyone else in Hopersville, the Schofields drew their water from a pump in a large park on the far side of the tree-covered hill, hauling it a long distance for their cooking and washing. Maybeth told me that sometimes fetching the water could be a harrowing experience, because the townspeople hated Hopersville, and if you encountered them in the park, they threw insults and sometimes even rocks. Just the thought of anyone being cruel that way to Maybeth made me angry. It was well after noon by then. Mother Beale was sitting on a crate, knitting. The twins were playing marbles around a circle Lester had drawn in the dirt. When they saw Maybeth, they cried out for her to play. In a while, she put them off. "We followed Papa," she began an explanation to Mother Beale. "He's back," the old woman said with a sigh of exasperation. She nodded toward the teepee, from which came a loud snoring. "He used your mother's pearl brooch this time." "I haven't worn that brooch in years," Maybeth's mother said from the clothesline. "He could have traded it for gas money, Sarah." "Enough to get us where? Not all the way to Chicago." Mother Beale's eyes went to the truck, much of whose engine lay disemboweled on the ground. "We may never get there now." "He tried, Mama," Mrs. Schofield said. Mother Beale's face was hard, but her voice was not when she said, "I've got some bread and cheese if you two kids are hungry." Just then, Captain Gray came limping into the Schofields' camp. "Police are sweeping through Hopersville, looking for someone." "Who?" Mother Beale asked. "I don't know, but they're tearing everything apart. Best not get in their way." Now I could hear the barks of dogs, lots of them, and distant shouts. Mr. Schofield stumbled from the teepee, trying to buckle his belt, his eyes a little unfocused, as if still in a drunken haze. "What's going on?" "Police," Mother Beale said, "searching for someone." "Go, Buck," Maybeth said. "Run." Everyone stared at me, surprise and suspicion on their faces. I heard the dogs coming toward us, but I just stood there, undecided. "Go!" Maybeth gave me a shove. "I'll find you." Without any idea of what it was all about, Mother Beale said, "Go on, son, and God be with you." I took off at a run along the bank of the Minnesota River. 100 yards away, I dove behind a thick growth of sumac and lay where I could see what went on in Hopersville. Officers with dogs on leashes moved swiftly through the encampment, rousting men from the shanties, barking at them harshly, a sound little different from the dogs. If a man objected, a billy club was the response he got. I felt terrible and guilty, because I knew I was the cause of all that disruption in a place where lives were already brutally disrupted. I watched 3 cops with a dog approach the Schofields, and I hoped that because there were children present the family might be spared the worst. But when Captain Gray stepped between the officers and the family, he was shoved to the ground and a snarling dog went at him. Mrs. Schofield cried out and tried to help, but she went down under a blow from a billy club. Her husband, who still hadn't succeeded in securing his belt, stepped toward the cop as if to defend his wife, but his pants fell down and he tripped himself and tumbled over Mrs. Schofield. Maybeth rushed to help her parents and was rewarded with a cop's boot to her ribs. Mother Beale pulled the twins to her bosom and shielded them with her old body. I couldn't take it. Couldn't just stand by and not try to help those good people who'd opened their hearts to me and their home, such as it was. I was blind with a rage far greater than any fear, and I stood up to run to their aid. I had no idea what I would do, but I wasn't going to let this travesty continue. Before I could take a step, a powerful hand grabbed my shoulder from behind, and a low voice growled, "Got you." The hand spun me around, and I stared into the face of Hawk Flies at Night.